Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Dan.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is David Labb.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick
I'm
Gillette.
Christopher
This is
Knopf.
Dr. Bob Greenberg.
I'm Laird Hamilton.
This is Doug DeAngelis from A3, and you are listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Doug DeAngelis is a composer whose film and TV credits are a mile long and include features and series, comedies, dramas from the 90s through to today. But his music credits include Babyface, Lisa Stansfield, Incognito, Love and Rockets, Peter Murphy, Nine Inch Nails, Taj Mahal, Queen Latifah. Man, I'm getting worn out here. The list is a mile long. And just to punctuate that point, I will say I'm not going to read anymore. You guys should look on DougDeAngelis.net. And you keep your website fairly well updated, Doug?
I will do that. I try to, yeah. You know, it's always, I'll be honest, it's always the last thing on my mind. But
who's got time?
I will certainly make an effort to.
Well, there's plenty of stuff to look at in the meantime, but what we really got interested in was we were at NAMM this year, and we had a great time there, and you hosted a panel on artificial intelligence, AI, and music. And so we want to talk about that too.
Before we get too far into that too, when you talk about Doug's work with the AI side of things, he also has a website for that, and that's www.a3exchange.com. Or on Twitter, you can grab the A3 AI side at A3E_event, or you can just grab Doug at Doug DeAngelis. And if you get lost and confused, at Pete A. Turner, at John LG69, and of course at Break It Down Show. We'll gladly get you where you want to be. This is going to be a cool conversation. Sorry about that, fellas. I had to do that so everybody would know where to go and follow along.
Yeah, we got to point folks to all the right places. So, Doug, tell us, let's just rewind and recap your music career very quickly. How did you get into production, and what on earth gravitated you to this crazy life?
Wow, okay, well, attention deficit disorder would be the first. If you wanted the honest answer to that, that would be it.
Perfect.
I grew up with incredible ADD, and as the only thing that could ever keep my attention focused was music. That is actually the God's honest truth.
Wow.
And the minute I discovered the recording studio, which was really young, I actually used to, as a little kid, I used to ride my bike to the music store and mess with synthesizers. I just was fascinated by synthesizers, but nothing else. And so I was a little kid, I'd ride my bike every day, and there was a guy that worked there, and he was just awesome. He would take me and teach me kind of like, talking like the early Moog era, late 70s, not even into the early 80s, pre-MIDI days. And he would kind of walk me through doing that, and it turned out he owned a recording studio in Connecticut where I grew up. I wound up over at his place and seeing multi-track recording for the first time, and he was awesome enough to start teaching me some of that when I was a real, probably 15 or so.
Wow.
Yeah, so I started really young, and then I went to Berkeley, and again, riddled with one of the most difficult things to go to school with, which is ADHD. It's a very difficult thing for kids in school. I always had a really hard time in school, but I knocked on the door of a recording studio around the corner from Berkeley that was owned by the band The Cars, who kids probably don't know who that is anymore, but another good Google for you. They were fantastic.
We just actually had a recent album fight, Cars versus Bon Jovi, since they both went into the Rock Hall. Woo! We put Heartbeat City against Slippery When Wet, and It was a motherfucker of a fight.
Yeah, that was everybody was bloody at the end of that.
Yeah, I would imagine. Okay, I'll keep my opinion to myself, but that it was. It kind of happened at the period when they were splitting up, and there was producers that I had been working with on an album project, and I long story short, I wound up working at that place, and I was kind of their staff, like programmer and engineer. Because I had a lot of programming background. I could really program synthesizers, and so that was kind of the early days when, like, the first emulator, like the emulator 3. Well, it wasn't the early time of that. It was the time when it was turning into the first hard disk recording platforms. Like, things were changing right then, and we were starting to enter the digital era. We hadn't gotten into Pro Tools and all of what we, became the norms yet, but we started to have things like Fairlight, exactly.
Yeah.
E3, things like that were these platforms to actually start to record music on. And I was an E3 guy, an Emulator 3 guy, and I would just bring every project into that studio I could find, and along the way, one of them that came in was Pretty Hate Machine, 9 Inch Nails.
Wow.
And so that was we did 2 songs with a producer named Flood from England, who is just one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. And
okay, hold on. You're going through too many things. I got to stop.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. This is why we do all this stuff. Yeah, Flood is, though he's done everything he could possibly do, maybe not everybody understands who Flood has worked for and with. Talk a little bit about that, and then talk about what you do recognize as the young guy sitting in the room. I mean, I'm assuming you knew who you were sitting with, or did it take a minute?
It took a minute, because, I was only 18, maybe 19, Flood is, brilliant. If you want to see his work as an engineer, look at, the Joshua Tree. Those early U2 albums that he did just an incredible job with. If you want to see his work as a producer, well, at that time, he had just flown into Boston from LA, I believe. He just finished the Violator album for Depeche Mode, which put that up as a shootout. Man, that's a good one. As far as production goes, that is a beast. So I really, getting the opportunity to work with him, but no, I've always had only one regret about that project, which is I wish I was a little older when it happened, so I could have appreciated it a little bit more. It was awesome. We stayed up for 5 straight days in a row. We recorded Head Like a Hole, and we recorded Terrible Lie, and no one ever went to sleep, I don't think, in 5 days. And when we were finished, he left as fast as he came, and that was about the beginning and the end of the story. But it was definitely a moment in time that I learned the feeling that you get when you know something special has just happened in a studio. And that is a very incredible feeling that, I don't know that in the democratization of music world you necessarily can even tell that, because everybody's recording music constantly right now. But that was a moment in time where I walked out of the room and went, wow, that's incredible what we just did. So,
well, here's the thing about that. First of all, very few people get to feel that feeling. And we maybe feel little morsels of that feeling, but a record that's a monstrosity like that, anybody's lucky to get near that feeling. So I'm glad that you bring that up, because that's really a measure of when somebody's career has pieces of greatness in it. The other thing is, I'm so glad that you confirmed my beautiful suspicions about the unhealthy sleeping habits surrounding that record and whatever else, because man, it's a monster, and it's almost like you have to have been in a place where human beings don't often get.
Yeah.
Mentally.
It was definitely an emotional playground that I've never seen again. It really was. No doubt. He's a brilliant artist. Flood was a genius record producer that was incredibly taxing. It was the first time I'd ever seen loops, which now is sort of, like cereal, I suppose. It's like everybody and their mother's seen it. But at the time, I remember Trent bringing in his MacBook. Not MacBook, forget MacBook. His Mac Plus, and setting it up and thinking, what's he going to do with that? Doesn't he want to use the emulator? What's he going to do with that thing?
Maybe he's going to hit it with a stick.
Yeah. Well, at the time, of course, it was just, Performer. It was just, a big triangle and a stop and a start button. There was no audio. It was pre-digital audio days in computer, but it was just used for sequencing, and he was doing those very first, incarnations of that I had ever seen in the world of what then ultimately became genres of music. Hip hop wouldn't exist without that technology, and ultimately, obviously, it doesn't go anywhere near being credited to that moment. It's Ray Kurzweil and Stevie Wonder, and sampling is an incredible whole discussion on its own of birthing so many forms of music. But that was the first
And
time
Roger
I've ever
Lynn.
seen people
Don't forget
actually
Roger
grab
Lynn.
bits of audio and do that. And I was like, what are we doing? Okay, I get what we're doing. And there was some
terrific.
fascinating moments. I mean, we did the guitars on that record with an old Yamaha Rev 50 or something it was called, a little tabletop SBX 90, and was just the distortion completely red lighted on that. That's the guitars that tone we were using.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but it was a lot of fun.
a lot of experimentation that folks have tried to duplicate, and with gadgets that don't come near. Those are the gems. I love hearing about stuff where you go, yeah, this is what we did. And we just had a conversation with Wes Maybe, and he was talking about the guitar intro for Reelin' in the Years and how it was recorded on an SVT amp turned all the way up, just completely overdriven, overdriven bass amp. Now, if you tried to replicate that sound, you'd do a whole lot of things before you got to here. Let's plug in this SVT top and turn it all the way up. And, when you have those gems that it's a puzzle, it's a mystery. And it's great to hear confirmation that so much experimentation was happening that nobody could, you could try to duplicate it if you want. And
yeah,
the only way now is to sample it.
Yeah. I mean, look, it set up one of the greatest pluses and greatest minuses of my career in music. The great plus of that is it was one of the very first real projects I ever worked on, and it taught me to never follow the rules, ever.
Awesome.
The downside of it is it taught me to never follow the rules.
Can't follow the rules.
To this day, I don't follow the rules at all. And people now, now I live in Nashville, and Nashville's all rules, and so people look at me like I'm kind of nuts here, but I can't. I don't believe unique, great things ever come out of that.
Yeah, you start your career by literally being like a Sherpa on an Everest climb. So you don't want to go down to the local state park and climb to the top of some hill.
No.
And that's definitely a career-defining thing. What has it given you in terms of the positive? Like, what is there a time when you reached for something that you thought, yeah, this is worth reaching for, and you were able to get it because of that experience?
I don't have a moment like that, but I do think that, what it did was it led me into dance music because it did. It was definitely like I got off one bus and into the train station and then onto another bus, but I wound up on the dance music bus at the end of the day, and on that path for the next 10 years. And what it did do is it did teach me that thing of experimentation and always looking for something new. And in the early era of dance music, when house music was new and all that was sort of beginning and coming out of Detroit and out of New York, that mindset to find those things was a big part of what was appealing to those DJs when you were working together. And I don't think any of us knew, I didn't recognize how gifted they were at understanding emotionally what somebody's going through on a dance floor. And I also didn't understand that I had that quest to do things and how much that appealed to them. It was just a good chemistry that I don't think either one of us really knew was happening, but together it made, let's make this kick drum sound like the speakers are going to explode. Let's make that delay sound like it never ends. So you have to, the mastering engineer has to cut it off in the mastering lab because it's feeding back for 4 minutes after the song ended. Let's run her voice through, a comb, and it was any kind of bizarre anything you could do just to just experiment.
Spectacular. Yeah, one of the struggles, I was going to say, let Big Bass Brian take care of it. I just like to shout out Big Bass Brian when mastering engineers come up. But the struggle that I have being a guy who's damn near 50 years old, who's a hip-hop head, is a lot of people that I get around who are, older performing musicians struggle with getting hip hop and getting electronic dance music and getting the emotions conveyed and the variety and the dynamics. And, it's like, oh, it's just machines. People don't make music like they used to. And god damn, nothing makes somebody sound like an old fuddy-duddy. Like just not getting it and not getting the adventurous nature that it takes to have a limitation like this is for the dance floor. And when you have to apply all of your artistry to separate yourself, from all of the other stuff that's for the dance floor, I've said before on the show that Alfred Hitchcock said the worst enemy of cinema is lack of limitation. And the thing that drags innovation out of people is here's this little box that's called the dance floor. It has to be loud. It has to be thumping. It has to be driving. Now, how are you going to make yourself different from somebody else? And, when folks don't get it, sorry, folks, you sound like old ass. You sound like an old ass. Anyway.
No, it's a great topic. I mean, it's something that people ask about and talk about a lot.
Yeah. So in that regard, though, I want to go back to your music education because you studied at Berkeley. What did you study? Were you a composition student or were you?
I was a music synthesis student. They don't have that major anymore. Now it's EPMD or something, electronic production, music something or other. But at the time it was called the music synthesis degree. So that's what I studied. I honestly spent most of my time at Synchrosound. I spent the majority of my life in there.
Did you complete your education at Berkeley?
I sure did.
You are in fucking great company.
Yeah, no kidding.
I sure
that
did
school is amazing. And we want to, hey, everybody, go get your education and go get your education at Berkeley. If you're in music, there's no better place. But so many people, I was just watching Steve Smith this morning and he was like, yep, I made it through my 7th semester, but that's as far as I went. And then I went on tour with Jean-Luc Ponty.
I think it was 7th semester for me too. I think
awesome.
No. 5th semester.
You figured it out even sooner.
Yeah, I think it was my 5th semester.
John, do you recall, did Bryce Vine graduate? Or
no, he didn't finish either. He was too busy getting busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got sucked out of it. When I really was not supposed to get sucked out of it, I wound up going on a tour for a group called Inner City that was kind of the U.S.'s first house music that crossed over into the pop charts. We had I think the Inner City had Good Life was, I think, a top 40, maybe top 40 pop song here, but the same album in the UK had 5 top of the pop, I believe, it's a long time ago. I believe it was 5 number ones on it on one album. So it was this, because music was so different in the UK than it was here. There, at that time, it was probably 1990 or so, and DJs were famous people in the UK, but that wasn't how it was here. It was very different here. So a friend of mine that knew me from Synchrosound was going to be the music director on that and asked me to come on that tour and put together. They wanted to recreate the record live. They wanted to do it with an all-live band but have it sound just like the album. So I designed a tour for Inner City where we played everything with sticks. It was all done with pads. It was all sampled and done with pads. So there was keyboard players, but it was lots of percussionists, and it was a really cool kind of way of doing it. And it was
that music synthesis degree at work.
Yeah.
Education.
Well, I loved all that stuff, and it was. But that record, if you go back and listen to that record, it's all very rhythmic. It was this whole, Kevin Saunderson was the Detroit techno guys, and there was this very rhythmic thing he would do with bass lines that was very similar in every song. But I thought it was so important to visualize that, and it gets really into the question you asked a minute ago about some people getting electronic music and not getting it. And I think ultimately when you talk about that, electronic music is about immersion. And if you're not somebody who can get that sense of immersion in music, you're going to have a really hard time with electronic music and hip-hop. It's something that you get immersed in it, it takes over, and then things that are very simplistic and repetitive and trance-like become so hypnotic and so emotional to you But if you're not in that state, it's very hard to ever get that. And getting that early experience with Inner City was really visualizing what these rhythmic things were that were making that record a hit record. It was a sound that he had created. So recreating that, I wanted to recreate that in a way where people could see it. So they weren't just ignoring it, but they could actually
That is awesome.
see it the way they would see, a band like The Who play. And to see it, you couldn't see it with a bass player playing strings, and it wouldn't have sounded right anyway, but you could see it with them playing electronic pads. So we went out and we did a lot of interesting things with pads and percussion, and it wound up...
But you take us all the way back to our base instinct as human beings, too. We're communicating with rhythm by hitting shit.
You want to see... Immersion takes multiple senses to be... That's why, when you get into music in the AR and VR world... It doesn't work if it doesn't cover all senses, right? So to really to get that immersive experience with electronic music is to have multiple senses covered by it, and that did that, and it did it really well. And having nothing to do with that, but just as a matter of what happened, that tour was supposed to be 3 weeks long, and it wound up being about 10 months long. It just kept getting extended.
Those are the best kind of tours.
Extended. It never can. By the time it was over, I didn't know even where I lived anymore. My stuff was somewhere, and I was somewhere else, and so I just went and got my stuff out of Boston. And at that point, I moved to Detroit and started working with Kevin Saunderson and those guys. And then I was kind of commuting back and forth to New York every week, and I was working in New York and in Detroit, and I would drive back and forth, and then eventually I made the move to New York. So
that's a beautiful story, man. I like it because the ride was going to be a short ride, like a chick you met. And it turns out, I was just going to roll around the hay with her for a little while, and we ended up backpacking all the way through Europe.
We sure did, man. It was a long trip through Europe too. We backpacked.
That's terrific.
Hard. Yeah, no,
this is great, man. I really appreciate that you had, this experience that involved creating everything, creating music that occupied all of the senses. I just wish you would have stretched a dead animal skin over like a piece of old petrified mahogany so people could go, this music is great, but what does that smell?
That's what they say about my personal music.
or at that time you could have piped in a cool water cologne or something. Anyway,
I like there's always a negative connotation to being Shanghaied, but you really Shanghaied yourself, and I've always been looking for the positive version of that. Yeah. But this is it right here. You Shanghaied yourself into this long tour and went all over Europe, and I love that part of it. I wanted to ask you, so the other day we did an album fight with Purple Rain versus 24 Karat Magic, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
And we tried
our
best.
What do you think won?
What's that?
What do you think won?
Depends on who you were doing it with.
well, this is my question then, right? So you go against one of the greatest albums ever made, against one of the best albums that's been made in a long time. The thing that we found, at least in terms of this, version with the judges that we have, John and I are of course judges, was that Bruno's music is wonderful, but it starts to become vapid in this setting where you hear song after song after song. And so you lose the immersion. You lose that because the trance isn't strong enough to hold you. It's like you've come out of the stripper dust has worn off. What are your thoughts on the ability of someone like Prince to take you on this ride track for track that's so incredibly powerful versus what Bruno Mars, and we love Bruno Mars. We love everything those guys do, but there is a difference. It's hard to put our fingers on it though.
First of all, I would completely agree. If I had to put a contemporary and a historic up against each other, I think that's an amazing battle. Bruno Mars for me is one of the few contemporary artists that I feel like hits on that level. I think a better album flow example maybe was Unorthodox Jukebox, because it did go through more different things and it did have more of that classic album sensibility maybe than the newer album that came after it, which more production driven and less maybe classic songwriter driven. I mean, he was really playing with styles on that album and kind of messing with your brain that he could pull all these things that you kind of knew from the past and turn them into brilliant new songs that really were as original as anything you've ever heard, you know, and they became hits on their own. Anyway, to your point though, if you asked me, I think that back in the era when Prince was making records like Purple Rain, and you had other artists doing things like people like Peter Gabriel, even artists like Duran Duran in that era. I think that there was more of a definitive emotional connection between the tools that define their sound and their musical chemistry than there is now, when there's a million tools to work with and you're bringing in all different people and there's lots of there's just so many variables going on that you don't come out with a product that has this thing that people latch onto, that they stick with and it latches. And when you go back to those early Prince records, he created an identity out of his musicianship and then these certain things that he was working with record by record, and they built the identity of that album, and he beat the shit out of them. You know, he really worked in so many different ways, but it was this iconic sound. And I don't know that we do that anymore. I don't know that we have the mental freedom to have that kind of intimate isolation with something that motivates you, that's something that inspires you the way we did back then.
Explain this a little more. Help me with what you mean by that, because I mean, are you talking about like the Lindrum, the Telecaster sound on Dirty Mind, or the Lindrum? Lindrum.
I mean these classic sounds that became iconic sounds with that record, and his style of playing drums when you put him with a Lindrum became something no one had ever heard. Mm-hmm. You know, because it was
that snare drum sound lived for a several album period too.
It turned you upside down, you know, and it wouldn't have had that same impact when he was playing drums maybe on the earlier records where he was actually playing as a live drummer. He's an incredible drummer, but there was something about his style hitting that sonic palette that made the world stop and go, what is that? And then
somehow he did it differently than everybody else.
First or different or however it is, but it was simple, and it was like defined, and he kept doing it. He crafted albums around it, not just songs around it. It wasn't a trick, it was a statement. You know, it wasn't a moment, it was a movement. And there was something really magic about a lot of different artists in that era that were kind of marrying something to their musicality and it becoming an iconic sound together, that marriage. And I think nowadays we work with a million things and we try to put everything into something, and you know, you've got all different programmers working on it, all this and all that, and everybody's bringing a billion different pieces of software and stuff into it, and you don't have that sort of simplistic identity like that I think that people actually connect to. I think there's a thing about that people connect to that.
It's no different than if you go back to B.B. King and Lucille, and there is an instrument, and that is that artist's axe. And, you know, Unorthodox Jukebox did not have a signature drum sound, it was really, the tools were unlimited.
Or a signature writing sound, or you hit it right on the head with B.B. King, exactly. If you could drop him in and said, okay, let's put a classic B.B. King album up against B.B. King right now, but we're going to put him in a studio and we're going to change patches on a profiler and an Axe effects every time he plays, and we're going to bring in a whole bunch of different people, and they're going to put all different style percussion underneath it and do all different kind of programming and all kind of different. You'd go, what? You know, this is not... I'm in the middle of the flow of this beautiful B.B. King album because of what it is, and I think, you know...
Yeah, you made that sound clinical and fucked up.
I know, didn't I?
Yeah. But that's ultimately what happened with 24 Karat Magic in that fight, was that there's 14 people in a room fighting Prince by himself but Prince made the better calls, shot after shot. And some of that is like one of my criticisms of the album was that Bruno Mars can get anybody to play bass on his album, and there's no bass credited at all. And that means that Carol Kay can't sit there and go, nope, the bass line is this, doom, 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 doom. And you're like, oh, fuck. Like there's something you can catch on to because that's Carol Kay is the bass. She wrote all those bass lines that were incredible, and you don't have to tell her how to do it. She just can do it. There's a pivot, and it's modern music now. It's how it is, and it all sounds great, but there is something that we definitely lose as that time goes on, and that's always happened throughout music history. I mean, there's things that just they're not worth exploring anymore.
Absolutely. And it's nobody's, it's not a criticism either because
right.
We don't work in the same music business as Prince worked in when he was making Purple Rain. We don't work in an album-oriented business. We don't even have labels that even think that way right now. I mean, we work in a completely single-motivated time where, we're starting to see a trend now where people aren't even making full records. They're doing little micro things. And I don't know.
You think that's for better or for worse? This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Is it for better or for worse?
Yeah.
I think it's just is what it is. I don't think, if I say it's for worse, then I sound like the old fart who doesn't understand hip-hop music. But to me,
you didn't take the old fart bait.
To me, to me, it is what it is, and we're not going to get around it. It's the consumption model of music, and you can't. The consumption model wins. So
the consumption model even seems to be even faster too. Like when I watch young people play music, they often play just a short portion of a song and then they're on to the next song. They don't even listen to a 5-minute ballad. Forget it. Done. Not going to happen.
Well, outside of music, interestingly, I was looking at my son's been bringing these books home. He's 9 that he brings home from school that he's reading. The chapters are only 2 and 3 pages long in them. A 200-page book has 95 chapters.
The consumption model winning. But you know what? What you just made me do was I thought back to when I was 9. I wish I probably would have gotten into books a lot sooner if they had been more accessible to my 9-year-old sensibility that way.
Yeah. Well, the world is very sensitive to how people consume now. We don't consume what they want you to consume. They make stuff for us to consume. Right?
Yeah.
We were trained to eat whatever they put on the table back then. Now
that's right.
There is a chef behind every door, and they're cooking exactly what they know you'll eat, and that's the way the world works now. So I don't think you can decide yourself, what's better or what's worse. But there was certainly a magic to the era when people like Prince were making records that flowed through a whole thing like that, and I guess the part of that whole equation that I brought up a minute ago with the instruments of the time and the people of the time, it was also a very different time. At that time, you would latch onto instruments of that time, and they were blank slates. They became what you did with them, as opposed to in the modern era of making music. We're given tools to make music, and those tools lead you in a direction musically, very often. It's certainly in the electronic world. I mean, there are you go to specific things for specific purposes. Where I remember in the early days of making electronic music, you would save. Things were expensive; they were a few $1,000s, and it did absolutely nothing beautifully. It was the greatest thing ever, but you had to do it. Like a Jupiter 8 or things like that. At the time, it was like the luscious, most beautiful instrument in the world, but it didn't come loaded with loops and parts, and you just held F sharp and B flat, and you had a song, and you could just kind of be like, that's it, cool, I'll just cut that and then I'll sing over it. It was a lot of work to get those instruments to have a personality. And that's where the genius of somebody like Prince was able to give those things his personality. He just laid himself over those instruments, and they became just like, anybody else who was playing music with him, So
wow, that's a great description of that, because nowadays there's so much mud in the water. I think that there's still plenty of room for somebody to put their personality on top of a tool that that conveys their stuff, and there will always be greats who can do that. But it just seems like the tool is a lot more. It's no different than the democratization of music to begin with, in that the tools are so robust that there's a lot of mediocrity. And I guess our job now has become to wade through the mediocrity, or figure out how to cut through it. And since we no longer have the gatekeepers, there's just a whole lot more stuff out there. But the cream does still rise to the top.
It does, and I had a really interesting conversation with a couple of guys at that last A3 in Anaheim. It was BT and Richard Devine, and we were talking about this kind of whole, being overwhelmed by the tools, and that sort of, whatever you'd call it, sort of tool numbness that we get from you walk in and you sit down, you've got 5,000 options of what to do, and so you basically just shut down completely, you don't do anything. And we all shared the exact same feeling independently, which was we've taught ourselves in the last few years to isolate down to just one thing that we want to work with and not even look at the rest, and focus on one thing to make a piece of music, or to make a score or a soundtrack, or one or two, but really pairing it into, I'm going to take this instrument and make this piece of music today, whether it be a software-based thing or a guitar or bass or whatever. But really,
that's cool.
Get back to that thing, because I think we all felt the same thing of this kind of overload of too many options, and it just ultimately leads to mentally shutting down.
What about another aspect of this democratized music world is I make beats. Like, there's 1 million people that make beats now. And if an emerging music type like trap comes out, not that trap is brand new, but it's a newer type, you can become flooded and inundated with people like, oh yeah, the trap game, I'm into that. And now there's 1 million competitors. Do you have to, as a composer, go, okay, I need to put this far enough ahead so that my 5 semesters of Berklee training is actually used, and that some kid in a garage somewhere can't just emulate this within 2 weeks of me putting it out and muddy the water, like Jon was saying? Is there a need to push or innovate in a way that, I don't know.
Not really. I don't think so. I think that what separates the people who lead and the people who follow is a very nuanced decision-making process. It's not being able to do the same sound or do the same feel or do the same, rhythmic things. It's the little nuanced decisions that you make that are unusual, that are rule breakers, that are, things like, when you listen back to, like Amy Winehouse, and you listen to those tracks and you go, who does that?
Holy shit.
Who does that? That's brilliant, Could I do it now? Sure. I heard him do it. But
now,
who the hell would do that? Who would...
I want to explore that a little bit, because the nuanced positions you're talking about when it comes to those minute decisions are cultivated in the fact that you, first of all, did the work that was necessary with your ADD to lock yourself into something that got you to Berkeley, first of all. And then when you got there, people don't always consider that the thing that separates a place like Berkeley from just some kid learning a piece of equipment is that you are just piled with music projects. You have to do shit the whole time you're there. And then all of a sudden you have created these condensed years of experience that, hey, every once in a while, a great talent comes along and some kid's got the instrument and he gets it in a way that we all love and that nobody else gets it. But usually it's a whole lot better and you get to that nuanced decision-making place when you've been fucking immersed like you have.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you went from working. It's not like you dropped out of Berkeley because you were lazy and you smoked too much weed. You left Berkeley because you had to go on a long tour that got longer. And really, all the people that we talk to who say, yeah, I went to Berkeley and then, I never finished because I went on the road with whomever. It's because that environment immerses you in so much work that all of a sudden you're doing all kinds of heavy lifting. So it's great to cook it down into it's, these nuanced decisions, but there's a reason for that. There's a reason you get to that granular place. It's because you've done all that fucking work.
Yeah, and it's from being in a room with people like Flood and watching him make those nuanced decisions and going, oh, that sounded like a mistake to me for a second, but now I see why he grabbed it. I actually think it was a mistake, but he didn't treat it like a mistake.
Right.
And he didn't turn around and go, hey guys, did you hear that mistake I just made? That was genius.
He was nope, I'm going to own this.
He just owned it and rolled along with it, and all of a sudden there was this weird moment in the middle of a song that did something strange, and you went, wow, that's intense. And you started to recognize those things when you're working. I mean, I'm an explorer when I'm working. I once I find the trail, then I can roll very quickly, but it's figuring out, something unique to get on first that is, I feel like, is going to be a successful path, and isn't just going to be making something I've heard already or done already, and again, listening back through time, when I look at all my favorite records, they were always filled with weird little, quirky, nuanced things like, whatever that first Portishead album was. I don't know if it was the first one, but the big Portishead album back in the day, Sour Times, I think it was what it was called, right? Sour, whatever it was.
I think that's right.
God, that record was genius. And the quirkiest, how the drums kind of sounded like they were metallic, and the weird little rolls and little things he would do, or it was very much in the realm of things like Massive Attack at that era and stuff, where there was these unusual little things. And so, in dance music, we really love those things. We really latch on and explore those things hard, because those are the little quirky things that when somebody's immersed in the feeling of music, ultimately it becomes this very gigantic spatial experience, and those little quirky things are like the North Star. They're the thing that the light, the thing that you grab onto. You're not worried about all the rest of it. It's just flowing. Your body's immersed in all that, and it's that little quirky thing that's repeating that you're going, and you're just reaching for it.
When you're describing that, I'm thinking about God Lives Underwater and the vibe that those guys created. And, it didn't last very long, partly because one of the guys died, but you definitely had that North Star bass, where it just... God, that was good music.
Yeah, and in the midst of, in those things, you'll hear tracks that don't have that, and it's cool. It'll get you through 3 minutes if you're already in it. But when one comes on and it has it, you just go... and you just find yourself just dying to and that's immersion, that's the thing.
We're going to run out of time if we keep going down this road, but it's so great to
we could go down this road all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I love on this, but I really want to ask you, and this is where, so Jon is a little ahead of me on the electronic appreciation stuff,
okay,
and I think I'm a little ahead of him on the AI things, where we're going to put the robot in charge of programming some of this music. And when I saw you at the NAMM show, you guys were talking basically about some of that underscore music that you write. Some of that stuff can be predicted, like Garden Path with sunlight shining in the early evening sounds like this, because we've done that sound 500 times. What is coming, man? How do we know what a hit sounds like when we hear it? And the computers can hear all the songs ever, so it seems to be that they could extrapolate pretty successfully what great sounds like.
No question. No question. We're not there yet. So for those who are going to listen to this, they'll say no way. But from a technological standpoint of can the machine interpolate all, extract what makes a hit and be able to, absolutely. How that will progress, I don't really know yet. But I mean, I'm seeing so many fascinating AI projects right now doing A3E. It's, I was actually just looking at one yesterday or the day before. I was putting together first we're starting this thing called A3E Global now, which is a sort of an online version of it, and I'm starting with AI because it's just a huge. A3E actually started with AI. The very first keynote I ever did was on AI, and it was an interesting one because it was in Boston at Berkeley, not at Berkeley, but across the street at the convention center, and I had some brilliant music technologists, and then I had David Mash, who was the dean of Berkeley, and he's tasked with, he's retired now, but at the time it was a 25-year ahead look at what Berkeley's going to do, and AI was an amazing topic to start with because you get back to what you're learning in school and all those things, but why are we going to be learning any of that? What's the purpose? How is this going to change the role of a musician and his instrument? How does it change the role of an engineer in a console? How does it change the role of anything, a director and a camera? So it's a huge question, way deeper than, will they be able to do it? That's my question is always more, what will we do? Because over time, we used to walk, or then we would ride horses, and then we started driving. We didn't stop getting places because we drove in cars. We just had a different job. Instead of walking or riding the horse, we drove the car. So,
could we? I just want to take an aside real quick. Next time at NAMM, can we set up a panel where you, Joe Walsh, Gene Simmons, and Vinny Colaiuta all discuss AI's role in music, and then it secretly will be just an old man make fun session because those guys are going to lose their minds.
Sure. You can't talk about it. You got to show them. You got to show them, and when they see it, it's scary. But when they can see, an avatar hearing harmonic figures and rhythmic figures and starting to play back phrases that complement that,
wow,
in real time,
yeah,
only then do they start to go, what? And it's it sounds kind of like hell right now because it is. But if you realize that a couple years ago it couldn't happen at all, and now they're playing back. We're trading fours back and forth soloing, and they're actually playing riffs that are based on what I played. If we change it rhythmically, they're following, they're starting to pick up, triplets over straight, things like that, and you go, and it's in real time. So
That's fucked up. That's real fucked up.
I know.
It's already happening.
Is it possible right now for you to go to Fillmore East and play all of Greg Allman's lines and have the computer go, oh, you're doing Fillmore East, and have it jump in and play that whole jam band session yet, you think?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And then
I think that's where it's headed, though. I mean, it sounds
totally.
It sounds like the interaction exists to where it's not just going to go, oh, I recognize it and repeat back, but it's going to recognize it and go, I always wondered what this ending would sound like if we...
Yes.
Well, here's the big question, though, and I'll tie you back into what we were talking about a minute ago. Will the machine ever be able to make the clever, nuanced decision?
Yeah, it will be because it can beat a human in Go, and that's all clever, nuanced stuff, right?
It might be. It might be able to start to recognize what those things are, but can it perceive a mistake as something that's pleasing? This is where machines are tricky because machines only know what they're supposed to know. A machine, you're feeding it data sets. And when you feed it data sets and tell them these are good things, it knows do these things. When you feed it data sets and say this is not the direction we want to go, it starts to rule those things out. The question is, will machines ever be able to override that and say, you fed me something that's a negative, but it actually worked and I turned it into a positive?
So when when he grabs the wrong instrument or whatever, makes that mistake, or when Brian Eno goes into the studio with U2 and he makes that funky beat from Moment of Surrender, and he's like, oh shit, I can't fix this thing fast enough. And then Larry sits down and goes, oh, I'll play with this. And then 20 minutes later, an actual complete song shows up.
Gene.
Isn't the computer going to be able to go, here are all these instances of mistakes that turned out right? I mean, even if they don't know if they're mistakes, like these now become good decisions to them.
When somebody creates a data set out of all those things and teaches them, I mean, ultimately, you have to teach the machine what to do. And, a great leader from a great company, Line 6, said to me one day, I said, do you eventually think this will impact musicians and make it so there aren't jobs for musicians? He was actually part of that for that keynote.
Yeah, I remember that guy.
And he said to me, no, he said, we're always going to want to hire the best musicians to teach the machines.
Right.
I agree. Not only that, but if you go back to the nuanced decision, there are always going to be people who go, no, that's bad. And the difference in the human is the human's going to go, yeah, never mind whether I'm admit to the mistake or not. I'm going to fight for that decision. Yeah. And there's the thing is that as a collaborator, the machine's going to acquiesce when a human being might fight.
Yes. The other part of that is that it's rare when you make a mistake that's a good thing musically that it's like, oh, did you hear that? I made a mistake and it was 5-part harmony, like it was Bohemian Rhapsody. Listen to that mistake I made. It's perfect. That's not the way mistakes work.
That's
mistakes
not how it works.
Something that you hear something special in the mistake, and then you just start. It's like excavating rock, or dinosaur bones. You start pulling away all the dirt and trying to figure out where the bone is. You know what I mean? It's not clear at first, but you saw something. You're like, I saw it right there, and I'm going to dig and dig and dig until I find what that thing was and how I can put it in context to this piece of music and have it be special. And
that first time that DeAngelo had a snare drum sample where the attack was just a touch late, and that became the signature of his sound, but a machine would have said, oh my God, that is a repetitive error. We have to correct it. And, it's no different than whether quantizing will ever replace human performance. Quantizing in electronic music is absolutely terrific, and it drives us and it makes us dance and all that stuff. But the humanity of there's always going to be a humanity that is not replicatable. That's my feeling.
I think that we're going to get, because we can take and put a room on a keyboard, like we're going to do this at Carnegie Hall, we're going to do this at that one drum room at Capitol, all these different places. I think we'll be able to take the musical choices that, Garth Hudson would make on the keyboard and how he would transition out of a weird key into something else. And you could put that on a dial on your AI guy and say, I want a little more Garth, and I want a sensibility of Trent Reznor.
Yeah.
And then you can say, oh, you know what? That sucks.
Well, those are very doable AI things, though, because those are data sets. Those are, you can look at a body of music where there's a repetitive use of techniques that reach an outcome musically. I think that anybody who doesn't think AI will be able to do that kind of musical work, they're already wrong, because it already does.
Yeah. So you have a palette of things to choose from. Like, I have this garden path, but I want it to be a little darker. Give me darker, or give me a brighter, or whatever it's going to be.
Correct. I think the question is, will it ever be able to make those nuanced? Will the machine ever be able to function using taste? And ultimately, taste is what makes fame and stars. It's that ability to catch that micro nuance thing and go, God, that's weird, but it's cool. And,
that's beautiful.
And that's beautiful, and that's me. I don't know that that'll ever happen, but I don't know that it ever won't. So that's about as far as I can. I'll kind of leave that thought right there, because I don't know that it ever won't either. And I think the one thing I've learned doing A3E that I had to really teach myself going into it, even as one of the founders of the show, I had to teach myself every day, don't doubt things. Stop doubting things, because you just keep being wrong. So I've learned really to not be skeptical and just keep my mind open and say, awesome, what does that then make me be able to do? What does that do? Just because the machine can take over a role that I used to have to do doesn't mean that there's not a new role or better use of my time with the gift that I have.
Well said. It frees you up to a different capacity. And, I heard, I think Pete brings up Vinnie Colaiuta because he's sort of a holdout in that your fellow Berkeley alum, by the way, he's kind of a holdout, and he's longing for the days where artists got album budgets to go into the studio and bring in a bunch of cats and really work through stuff and make Steely Dan records. Mm-hmm. And that is an era that has left us, and it's terrible that it has left us. But all we can do is look forward and try to figure out where all that talent's going to find its useful home.
Well, I think that we have to tackle a huge problem in the coming years, and that is, how do we make music have monetization value again? How do we monetize music again the way it used to be? It's such a it's a subject that a lot of people don't want to talk about right now. And there's a lot of people making a lot of money from music, and there's a lot of people that used to make a lot of money from music that aren't making a dollar from music anymore. But ultimately, those kind of things, like when you harken back to that Steely Dan era of that collective of the greatest players in one room, and then a guy who won't stop until the greatest players have played the greatest thing they've ever played.
Well said.
You're dealing with, ultimately you're dealing with like careers at that point. I mean, you're dealing with people that the only reason they can play that well is because they've dedicated their life to doing it. It's not a side thing that they do for 15 minutes at night or for an hour at night. That's their life. And they can't live their life.
And they were able to make a living.
Right. They can't live their life without being able to make a living doing it. They can't buy the kind of instruments, experiment with the kind of sounds, do all of the things that make all of those things from history happen if there's no way to support yourself doing it. And I think we really have to take a very, very deep look at our industry and say, are we doing that? Are we supplying the greats with what they need to be great? Or are we taking that lifeline away? And if we take that lifeline away, if we keep taking it away, where will we end up?
Oh, that's a really tough and depressing question, because it doesn't point to any place good.
No, it doesn't.
But
Well,
where do you think?
But there are good places, though. I mean, so one thing I wanted to go back and say is, and he's an innovation company, as long as the pace of innovation exceeds the pace of automation, you're always going to have a job, right? Like there's always going to be new frontiers to explore. And we have that now for these guys. Like Andy Summers isn't beholden to anybody artistically. Doesn't have to satisfy a label or anything. He can do whatever the fuck he wants to do, partly because he has a lot of money, but it also lets him go far afield in the art world and get there. And maybe there will be fewer people that are afforded that luxury, but there's always going to be people that can get to a place like Trent Reznor and just hyper warp us to a totally different place than we were sonically 6 months before his album came out. There's always going to be people like that can find that North Star that you're talking about. That's always going to be monetizable. Maybe not at the buy 5 homes in Malibu kind of level, but the ability to make a great living doing that's certainly possible.
I hope so too. And I'm not as optimistic. I mean, the thing is, like you said, the gathering of all those greats playing and playing and playing until they played the greatest thing they ever played. What we're talking about is a diminishment of the population of folks who can contribute to an artistic movement. And if there's going to be a Trent Reznor but there's only going to be Trent Reznor, then we're going to miss out on a lot of, a lot of things that are the building blocks of a piece of greatness that may never see the light of day because there's only one guy out there.
That's right.
With the quiet genius to be able to do it.
And that guy with that quiet genius had influences that had nothing to do with the kind of with the sound or the way he made music.
Right.
In a lot of ways, it had a lot more to do with the kind of ways we're talking about. So, where would that inspiration have come from?
Or will it come?
There's a lot of there's so much there right now, and I think when we can get into this another time, which I would love to, but I think it's very important for the music industry right now to look at other industries that have been much more
impacted by automation.
Well, I was going to say aggressive with innovation.
Yeah.
I think that one of the places that we are terribly weak as an industry is in innovating the way we do things. I think that, and I say that in not in the way not in our musical way, but in our technical way. And I'll just quickly say, if you look at the video games from 1977 to a video game today, there is almost no recognition whatsoever between the two boop, boop, the Pong with the two paddles and the green ball going back and forth, to Madden 18, where you can't even really tell if you're watching a video game or you're watching a football game. It's like they're barely able to even tell. And then you look at what we've done as an industry, and I when I say this, I lay this squarely on my own, people like me's shoulders. As when I started, when you go back to that room of Pretty Hate Machine, we were multi-track recording, making music that we mixed down into stereo, and you listen to it on speakers or headphones. And if we were doing that again today, we'd be multi-tracking that music and listening to it on speakers or headphones. And I just don't think that we have done enough with ingenuity and innovation to take the medium of music to new places that people will want to spend money on. I think concert world has done it. When I was a kid and I'd go to concerts, I'd go to Madison Square Garden and there'd be an opening act and a band. And then we'd all drive home. Or sometimes there'd be two opening acts, and you were like, yeah, two opening acts. And then we'd drive home. Now, what is it that drives kids to concerts? It's music festivals, and there's an art festival, and there's business going on over there, and I'm
about to go see U2 tomorrow night. You talk about money into the show.
There's 90 bands playing, and you're going to see everything you love in one weekend. It's this massive experience. But so the world of concerts has changed radically. The world of gaming has changed radically, and those things have been very monetizable over the years. I don't think we've done a very good job at that in making things. So that's been a big reason I moved to Nashville, was to really work in that field and try to create new ways of experiencing music that young people would say, I might not be willing to pay for that music, but I'll pay for a new way to experience that music. And therefore, I'm actually paying for that music.
That is terrific. And a lot of the great artists who are evolving with it, and Pete brought up U2, but they are constantly striving for new ways for us to enjoy music. And our artists in general have to do that. We want to definitely be respectful of your time, and you brought it full circle for us. But absolutely, please, let's do this again, and let's revisit this topic, and let's get back into it and pick up where we left off. And by all means, everybody, check out Doug DeAngelis, and thank you, man. Thank you for giving us your opinion today, for educating us about the world of AI. The next time we do this, we can, like I said, pick up right where we left off, because we're into it and we dig it, and we dig you. Thank you, Doug.
You're so welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Great, guys. My pleasure.